The hotel dining hall shined like a palace that evening. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, their light reflecting on polished marble floors. Waiters and waitresses moved carefully between tables, balancing trays filled with golden plates and tall glasses. The air smelled of roasted meat, sweet desserts, and expensive wine. Soft laughter, clinking silverware, and piano music from an old record player filled the room. Among the staff was a young black waitress named Clara. She wore the same uniform as the others, a plain black dress with a white apron tied around her waist, but she carried herself with quiet grace. She had learned to smile politely at rude comments, nod respectfully when guests ignored her, and keep her eyes lowered when some treated her as invisible. For Clara, this was nothing new. Clara had been working at the hotel for 2 years. Every day was long and tiring, but she needed the job to support her mother and younger brother back home. She did not complain. Instead, she carried her trays with steady hands and kept her posture straight, even when her feet ached. Most people saw her only as a waitress. No one in that glittering hall knew her secret, that music lived inside her like fire. From the time she was a little girl, Clara had loved the piano. Her father, before he passed away, had brought home a broken old keyboard from a second-hand shop. The keys were chipped, some did not even work, but to her it was treasure. She would spend hours pressing the good keys, listening carefully, and trying to make small tunes. As she grew, she learned how to turn those small notes into real songs. She dreamed of one day playing in a hall filled with people who listened, truly listened, to her music. But dreams were not easy for someone like Clara. She worked when others studied. She saved money while others spent it. And in the eyes of many guests at the hotel, she was nothing more than a servant. Still, whenever she passed the hotel's grand piano, polished black wood with shining white keys, she could not help but look at it with longing. That evening, the dining hall was especially crowded. Wealthy businessmen, their wives in glittering gowns, and young men in fine suits filled the tables. The clink of glasses and bursts of laughter echoed through the room. Clara moved quietly between them, carrying trays, clearing plates, refilling cups. She tried not to draw attention to herself. But she noticed every detail: the way people's eyes lit up at the music, the way the piano in the corner sat silent, used only for decoration now that the hotel had switched to recorded tunes. Clara wished she could sit there, just once, and play. She imagined her fingers dancing over the keys, filling the air with music that came from her soul. But she knew better than to hope. To the guests, she was invisible. To the hotel managers, she was only a worker. As the night went on, Clara's steps grew slower, her arms heavier. She paused for a moment near the piano, balancing an empty tray against her hip. Her eyes lingered on the instrument. The light from the chandelier reflected off its polished surface, making it gleam like a jewel. She wondered what it would feel like to touch those keys, not in secret, not in shame, but in front of people who truly listened. "Keep moving," another waiter whispered sharply as he passed her, carrying a tray of wine glasses. Clara lowered her eyes and nodded, but as she turned away, a voice cut through the noise of the hall. "Waitress." It was a loud, commanding voice. Clara froze for a moment, then turned slowly. A tall man in a dark suit sat at one of the front tables. His hair was slicked back, his rings sparkled under the light, and his smile was sharp, like he was used to giving orders and watching people obey. He was a wealthy businessman who had visited the hotel many times before. Clara had seen him often, surrounded by other rich men, laughing too loudly and speaking with arrogance. Now his eyes were fixed on her. "Yes, sir?" Clara asked softly, stepping closer. The man leaned back in his chair, looking her up and down with a smirk. "I see the way you look at that piano," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. A few guests turned their heads with interest. "You stare at it as if you think you could play it?" Clara's heart jumped in her chest. She did not reply. She lowered her gaze, but the man was not finished. "Well," he pressed, his voice mocking. "Do you even know what those keys are for? Or do you just like the shine of them?" Some people at nearby tables chuckled. Clara felt her face grow hot, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm sorry, sir. I have work to do." But the man waved his hand dismissively. "Nonsense. Sit down at that piano. Play something for us. Let's see if you're as talented as you think." The laughter grew louder. Other guests were now watching, curious and entertained. To them, it was nothing but a joke, a way to pass time. To Clara, it was humiliation. Her hands shook against the tray she carried. She wanted to walk away, but his command hung in the air, and the eyes of the room burned into her back. Clara stood still, her heart pounding, torn between fear and the secret fire of her love for music. The piano sat only a few steps away, silent, waiting. Clara stood frozen near the piano, the tray pressed tightly against her side. The businessman's voice still rang in her ears, sharp and mocking. Around the dining hall, guests leaned in with eager faces, waiting to see what she would do. For them, this was entertainment, a rich man's game. For Clara, it was humiliation in front of dozens of strangers. The businessman leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine with a smug grin. His companions at the table chuckled, whispering among themselves. "Go on, waitress," he said again, louder this time, his tone almost playful but with a cruel edge. "Show us your secret talent. Or are you afraid these fine people will hear nothing but noise?" More laughter rippled across the tables. Clara's heart thudded in her chest. She wanted to speak, to tell him no, but her voice seemed trapped in her throat. She glanced toward the other staff, but they avoided her eyes. None of them would step in, they knew better than to challenge a wealthy guest. The businessman tapped his fingers on the table impatiently. "Well? Don't keep us waiting. Unless you don't know how to play at all. Perhaps you only like to pretend you do." His words dripped with mockery, each one heavier than the last. Clara lowered her eyes. She remembered the nights she had sat by the broken keyboard at home, her mother watching quietly as she played gentle songs to soothe her younger brother to sleep. Music had always been her comfort, her escape. And now, here in this glittering hall, her love for it was being turned into a joke. The businessman stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. The sound was sharp, commanding attention. He gestured toward the piano with a sweep of his hand. "Come now. If you can play, prove it. If not, we'll all know the truth that you're just another waitress reaching above her place." A hush fell over the room. Even the laughter grew quiet. All eyes were on Clara now. The businessman's companions leaned forward, their smirks daring her to move. Clara's palms grew damp against the wooden tray. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor and escape those watchful eyes. But then she noticed something, her reflection on the shiny surface of the piano. The keys glowed faintly under the chandelier, calling to her. Somewhere deep inside, her father's voice echoed, "Never let anyone tell you music doesn't belong to you." Clara lifted her chin ever so slightly. She placed the tray down on a nearby table, her hands trembling. The guests watched with curiosity as she walked slowly toward the piano. The businessman smirked, satisfied. He whispered something to the man beside him, and they both laughed softly. "She's going to embarrass herself," one guest muttered. "She probably doesn't even know where Middle C is," another said with a chuckle. The cruel words floated through the air, but Clara kept walking. Each step felt heavy, but also strangely powerful, as if she was walking towards something she had been waiting for all her life. When she reached the piano, she paused. Her fingers hovered above the lid. For a moment, she closed her eyes and breathed in deeply. She could almost feel her father's hand on her shoulder, steadying her, encouraging her. Slowly, She opened the lid, revealing the gleaming white and black keys. The sight made her chest ache with both fear and longing. The businessman raised his glass in mock celebration. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced dramatically, his voice echoing through the hall, "our waitress will now give us a performance. Let us prepare our ears for something truly unique." His words drew a fresh round of laughter. Clara sat down on the piano bench. The seat felt strange, unfamiliar, as if it belonged to another world. She placed her hands gently on her lap for a moment, afraid to touch the keys too soon. The room buzzed with whispers, the crowd waiting, judging. "Play something simple," one man called out with a grin. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." The hall erupted in laughter again. The businessman smirked wider, clearly enjoying the show. "Yes," he said smoothly, "something simple. Don't strain yourself." Clara's hands finally rose and rested lightly on the keys. The feel of the smooth ivory sent a shiver through her. It was so different from the chipped, broken keys of her old keyboard. These were perfect, flawless, waiting for her touch. She pressed one key softly. A clear note rang out, echoing through the hall. Some guests chuckled. "That's it?" "One note," someone whispered. Clara ignored them. She pressed another key, then another, forming a small, uncertain chord. The sound was delicate, fragile. The businessman leaned on the piano, smirking down at her. "Careful now. Don't hurt yourself. It would be such a shame if the music didn't live up to your admiration." His words stung, but Clara kept her eyes on the keys. She was afraid, yes, but also determined. She had not touched a real piano in years, yet the feeling was familiar, comforting. She knew, deep in her heart, that if she could only truly begin, the music would guide her. The hall grew strangely quiet as she sat there, hands poised, hesitation heavy in the air. The laughter faded, replaced by curiosity. Even the businessman tilted his head, waiting for her next move. Clara's chest rose and fell with a deep breath. She closed her eyes again, blocking out the whispers, the smirks, the cruel laughter. In that silence, she reached inside herself and remembered why she loved music: not to impress, not to prove, but because it was her voice when words failed. When she opened her eyes, there was no fear in them, only resolve. Her fingers curved gently over the keys. She was ready. Clara's hands hovered above the piano keys, her breath shallow, her chest heavy. The dining hall was silent now, yet the silence was not comforting. It was heavy, sharp, filled with waiting eyes. She could almost hear the whispers hiding behind it. The rich guests leaned forward in their seats, eager for either a disaster or a miracle. Her heart pounded so loudly that she thought it might echo louder than the piano itself. Every second of hesitation seemed to stretch longer, pulling her deeper into fear. She remembered every time someone had told her she wasn't good enough, every time her dream of playing had been dismissed as childish. Now, sitting here under the glow of chandeliers, those voices came back to haunt her. "What if I fail?" she thought. "What if I press the wrong keys? What if they laugh at me again, louder this time?" Behind her, the businessman smirked with folded arms, his wine glass resting on the table. He enjoyed her hesitation. To him, this was not about music, it was about power, control. He had called her out to prove a point, and he expected her to break under the weight of humiliation. "Go on," he said softly, though his words carried across the room. "We don't have all night." Clara's fingers trembled. She pressed one key again, softly, the note ringing like a fragile drop of water in a storm. It was too quiet, too unsure. Someone at the back snickered. Another whispered, "I told you, she doesn't know what she's doing." Her cheeks burned hot. She wanted to get up, to walk away, to run to the safety of the kitchen where no one would look at her. Her body screamed at her to move, to escape. But her heart whispered something different: stay. Don't let him win. She thought of her mother, who worked long hours sewing clothes just to keep their small home together. She thought of her younger brother, who used to fall asleep listening to her clumsy lullabies on the broken keyboard. She thought of her father's voice, the way he had said once, "Music is not just sound, Clara. It is who you are. It cannot be taken from you." The weight of those memories held her in place. They reminded her that this moment was not only about humiliation, it was also a chance. Her hands still hovered, frozen, when suddenly the room shifted. A waiter passed by carrying a tray of glasses, and Clara caught the reflection of her own face in the polished silver. Her eyes looked frightened, small. She hated that look. She had seen it too many times in herself when people pushed her down. She had promised once secretly that she would not let anyone make her feel that way forever. Taking a shaky breath, she whispered to herself, "You can do this." Her lips barely moved, but the words gave her strength. Still, the fear was not gone. It clung to her like a shadow. She remembered the businessman's cruel tone, the smirks of the guests, the sharp laughter. The hall felt like a trap, the piano like a test she was destined to fail. She pressed another chord, this time 3 notes together. They sounded rough, uneven. A few people chuckled again, and Clara's stomach twisted painfully. The businessman leaned forward, pretending to encourage her, but his voice filled with mockery. "Ah, there it is. A true musician in the making. Please, don't stop now, we're all so eager to hear your masterpiece." The sarcasm cut deep. Clara's hands dropped to her lap for a moment. She stared down at the floor, her throat tight. She wondered if maybe it was better to stop before she made a fool of herself. But then she remembered something else, the way her brother's face would light up when she played, even if the notes were not perfect. To him, it had always sounded beautiful because it came from her heart. Clara looked back at the keys. She reached out again, this time resting her fingers more firmly on them. Her hesitation was still there, but now it was mixed with determination. Her whole life, she had played in silence, in secret, in shadows. Maybe this was the moment she was meant to step out. The crowd leaned in closer, sensing the change. Their laughter softened into anticipation. Even the businessman tilted his head, curious now rather than smug. Clara closed her eyes. She shut out the faces, the whispers, the laughter. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she was no longer in the hotel dining hall. She was back home, sitting in her small room with the broken keyboard. She could hear the faint sound of rain against the window, feel the comfort of her mother humming in the kitchen, see her brother curled up on the couch. She let those memories guide her fingers. Her hesitation did not vanish all at once. At first, her hands moved slowly, uncertain, like a child taking careful steps. But with each note, she felt the piano opening to her, welcoming her, reminding her that it had always been waiting. Her heartbeat slowed, her breathing steadied. The first shaky notes began to form a pattern, a rhythm. Something small and fragile, yet alive. The guests watched in silence now, their amusement fading as they sensed something stirring. The businessman's smile wavered just slightly, though he tried to hide it behind his glass. Clara was still afraid, but the fear no longer controlled her. She let her fingers rest gently, ready to begin again, not for them, not to prove herself to the rich man, but for the love she carried inside. And as she sat there, trembling yet steady, she knew she was one breath away from truly playing. The piano bench creaked softly as Clara adjusted her seat, her fingers resting gently on the keys. The air inside the dining hall was so still it almost felt heavy, as though everyone was holding their breath. Guests leaned forward, glasses half raised, forks forgotten. Even the clinking of silverware had stopped. The silence was hers now, but it was a silence filled with pressure, a silence waiting to crush her if she failed. Her hands shook slightly, her palms still damp from fear. She pressed one note, then another. The sound was delicate, trembling, as though the piano itself was nervous. A few guests chuckled quietly, but she ignored them. She knew these first notes were only the beginning, like the first step onto a path she had been afraid to walk her whole life. She closed her eyes. The hotel walls faded away in her mind. The chandelier light, the polished floors, the watchful eyes, all of it disappeared. Instead, she imagined the small, worn-down living room of her childhood home. She remembered the old broken keyboard her father had brought her, its cracked plastic and chipped keys. She had loved it anyway. She had loved it more than anything. Her fingers pressed down again, and this time, she allowed them to linger. A soft chord floated into the hall. It was imperfect but gentle, like a whisper of something hidden deep inside her. The crowd grew quiet. Even the businessman leaned slightly closer, his smirk dimming as he waited for the failure he was certain would come. But Clara did not stop. She let her fingers slide into another note, then another. At first, the melody was hesitant, searching, almost fragile. It was like a bird learning to spread its wings for the first time, wobbly, uncertain, but full of quiet courage. Her heartbeat slowed, her breathing deepened. She pressed another chord, and this one rang stronger, clearer. The sound echoed off the walls, filling the space in a way the guests had not expected. Some of them exchanged glances, surprised by the sudden richness of tone. The businessman shifted in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly against his glass. He wanted to laugh, to interrupt, but something in the way she touched the keys stopped him. There was no arrogance in her playing, no attempt to show off. It was something else, something raw and honest. Clara opened her eyes, and they shone with a quiet determination. She was no longer thinking of the guests, or of the man who had mocked her. She was thinking of the nights she had stayed awake, pressing broken keys into melodies. She was thinking of the way music had carried her through sadness and loneliness, how it had given her strength when nothing else could. Her hands began to move more freely now. The melody unfolded, soft but steady, like a story told in whispers. Each note connected to the next, weaving together into something fragile yet beautiful. The guests leaned in closer, their earlier laughter forgotten. A woman in a silver gown lowered her glass slowly, her eyes fixed on Clara's hands. A young man at the back stopped mid-bite, his fork hovering in the air. Even the waiters paused in their steps, watching quietly as the sound filled the hall. It was not yet grand or powerful, but it was honest. It carried with it the weight of Clara's soul, the years of longing, the secret hours spent practicing in silence. Each note was a piece of her heart placed carefully on the keys. The businessman frowned slightly. He had expected clumsy noise, a stumbling mess that would make her a laughingstock. Instead, he heard something delicate and strangely moving. He shifted again in his seat, hiding his discomfort with a forced smirk. Clara's hands trembled less now. The fear had not disappeared, but it no longer ruled her. She played another chord, stronger this time, and then slipped into a small run of notes that surprised even her. For a moment, she almost smiled. The piano was answering her, welcoming her, as if it had been waiting for her touch. The melody grew. It was still soft, still simple, but it carried a warmth that spread through the room. The guests no longer whispered. Their faces were quiet, thoughtful, caught by something they had not expected to feel. Clara let herself breathe into the music. She imagined her brother listening, his eyes half closed as he drifted to sleep. She imagined her mother smiling quietly in the kitchen, humming along without knowing. She imagined her father standing in the doorway, proud, telling her again that music could never be taken from her. Her hesitation was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer a wall blocking her, it was a bridge she was carefully crossing, Step by step. With each note, she grew braver. With each chord, she claimed a little more of the silence that had once threatened to crush her. The hall listened. Even those who had mocked her before now sat still, unable to look away. The chandelier light seemed softer, the air warmer. It was as if the music had transformed the room itself. Clara's fingers slowed. She let the final note of her hesitant melody linger in the air, fading gently like a sigh. For a moment, there was no sound but the quiet hum of the piano strings. The guests did not laugh. They did not mock. They only watched, waiting, unsure of what would come next. Clara sat with her hands resting on the keys, her chest rising and falling. She had begun. She had stepped into the fire of their judgment and found her voice. And though the song was still only beginning, she knew now that she could go on. Her eyes lifted slightly, meeting the chandelier light. Her lips pressed together in determination. She was ready to play not just for them, but for herself. And as her fingers rose again, poised to strike the keys with new strength, the silence broke not with laughter this time, but with expectation. The first hesitant melody still hung in the air when Clara's fingers pressed forward again, this time with more certainty. The fragile notes that once trembled like whispers began to weave together into something deeper, something stronger. The sound filled the grand dining hall in a way no one expected. It was no longer just a waitress at a piano, it was the birth of a song that came from her very soul. At first, the music was soft, almost like a secret shared carefully with the room. But then, like a spark catching fire, it began to grow. Clara's hands moved with more confidence, her body swaying slightly as though the piano and her heartbeat had become one. She was no longer afraid of the silence, she was shaping it, breaking it apart, and replacing it with sound. The crowd shifted in their seats. Some leaned closer, others sat completely still, caught off guard by the sudden change. They had come expecting a clumsy performance, something to laugh about later. Instead, they were witnessing a transformation right before their eyes. The melody swelled, no longer fragile but alive, carrying waves of emotion across the hall. It was as if the notes themselves spoke of her life, the struggles, the nights of loneliness, the quiet strength she had learned to hold onto. Each chord rang with a kind of honesty that no rehearsed performance could match. Clara felt it too. With every stroke of the keys, her fear melted away. She was not the nervous waitress anymore. She was the girl who had once sat for hours with a broken keyboard, creating music from fragments. She was the daughter of a man who had believed in her, the sister who played lullabies, the woman who carried a fire inside that no amount of mockery could put out. Her eyes closed as she played, her fingers moving with a freedom she had never dared to show in public. The room disappeared again, replaced by the images her music carried. She saw the small home where she had grown up, her mother's hands sewing late into the night, her brother's gentle smile, the flicker of a candlelight where she practiced. Each memory poured into the piano, transforming into sound that wrapped around every listener in the hall. The guests were silent. Their laughter had died long ago, replaced by awe. A woman in pearls pressed her hand to her chest, her eyes glistening. A young man who had been smirking earlier now sat forward, his mouth slightly open, as though he could not believe what he was hearing. Even the waiters at the back, who had seen countless nights of arrogance and wealth, stopped their work to listen. The businessman, the one who had mocked her, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His smirk had vanished completely. At first, he tried to hide his surprise, pretending to sip his wine, but his eyes betrayed him. He could not look away from her hands, from the way she had taken control of the very room he once ruled. Clara's music grew bolder still. It was no longer hesitant. It danced. It rose and fell like waves against the shore. It carried sorrow, yes, but also strength, also hope. Each note told a story of survival, of dignity, of the beauty found in pain. The chandelier light above seemed to shimmer in rhythm with the melody, scattering reflections across the marble floor. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier with sound. It was as though the entire hall had been transformed into a living instrument, vibrating with her spirit. Her fingers raced now, faster than before, gliding effortlessly across the keys. She was not playing to please anyone. She was playing because she could not stop, because the music had always lived inside her and finally had the chance to be heard. For once, she was not silent. For once, she was not invisible. A murmur spread through the guests' soft gasps, quiet sighs, the occasional sound of someone catching their breath. No one dared to laugh anymore. Instead, they were moved in ways they did not understand. The melody reached into them, reminding them of their own hidden dreams, their own silent struggles. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, though she did not stop playing. She had carried so much weight for so long, and now, through the piano, she was releasing it. Each chord was like letting go of pain she had hidden, each run of notes like breathing freely again. The transformation was not just in her playing. It was in her presence. She no longer looked like a servant trapped in her role. She looked like a musician and artist claiming her place with dignity. The businessman clenched his jaw. He had set out to humiliate her, but instead, he was the one shrinking in his chair. The applause building inside the crowd was not for him, not for his power, but for the very woman he had tried to belittle. He felt small, almost invisible, and the realization burned him. But Clara did not look at him. She did not look at anyone. She was lost in her music, her body leaning into the piano, her face calm yet shining with emotion. The notes filled every corner of the room, wrapping the guests in her truth. The melody soared higher, brighter, like a bird finally breaking free of its cage. The final chords thundered through the hall, powerful and unshaken. Then, slowly, she let the sound fall, softening into a gentle finish that felt like a sigh of relief. The last note lingered, echoing in the silence. Clara's hands stayed on the keys, her chest rising and falling quickly, her eyes closed. She had given everything she had to the piano, and for the first time in her life, she had done it in front of those who once doubted her. The hall was silent still, but it was no longer the silence of mockery. It was the silence of awe. The last note of Clara's song lingered in the grand hall like a breath no one wanted to release. For a moment, time seemed frozen. The chandeliers still glowed above, the glasses still sparkled on the tables, but no one moved. It was as if every guest in that glittering room was trapped inside the silence she had created. Clara kept her hands resting gently on the keys. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her heart pounding from the storm of emotions she had just poured out. She had forgotten about the guests, about the mocking words, even about the man who had forced her to play. For those few minutes, there had been only her and the piano. But now, as the silence stretched on, Clara slowly opened her eyes. She looked around the room, half expecting to see smirks and laughter ready to return. Instead, she saw wide eyes, parted lips, and faces frozen with disbelief. Some guests looked as though they had forgotten where they were. At the businessman's table, his companions sat stunned. One of them, a man with a golden pocket watch, had his mouth slightly open as if caught mid-word. Another, a woman in a glittering dress, blinked rapidly, her eyes shining as though she might cry. None of them spoke. And then there was the businessman himself. The man who had mocked her. The man who had called her out, expecting to humiliate her for his own amusement. His glass of wine sat untouched before him, his hand frozen halfway to lifting it. His face, once twisted in a smug grin, was now pale with shock. He blinked slowly, as if he could not quite understand what had just happened. He had wanted noise, chaos, laughter at her expense. Instead, he had been struck by something undeniable, something greater than his arrogance could cover. For the first time that evening, the powerful man did not look powerful at all. He looked small, almost uncomfortable, like someone who had been caught in a lie. His eyes darted toward the other guests, but they were not looking at him anymore. They were looking at Clara. The applause came suddenly. It began with a single pair of hands, then another, then a wave. Soon the hall erupted with clapping, echoing loudly off the marble walls. The sound grew so strong that it shook the air, louder than the piano itself had been. Clara's eyes widened in surprise. She had never played for applause before. At home, her songs had ended in silence or in her brother's sleepy smile. Now, the entire room stood for her. Some guests even rose to their feet, clapping harder, cheering as if they had just witnessed something unforgettable. The businessman flinched at the sound. His jaw clenched as he watched his guests, his audience, the people he had expected to laugh at her now stand for her instead. Their admiration was not his. Their respect was not his. It belonged to the very woman he had tried to shame. He shifted in his chair, his face hardening into a frown. He wanted to dismiss it, to make a joke, to regain control. But no words came. Each time he opened his mouth, the applause grew louder, drowning him out. Clara slowly rose from the piano bench. Her hands still trembled, but her back was straight, her chin lifted. She did not need to bow, the look in her eyes was enough. She had faced their judgment, faced his mockery, and turned it into triumph. The businessman finally forced a smile, though it was stiff and hollow. He clapped his hands slowly, reluctantly, as though hoping no one would notice his discomfort. But they did. His applause was weak compared to the storm around him, and his face betrayed him. He was not in control anymore. His companions looked at him uneasily. One of them leaned close, whispering something, but he did not respond. His pride burned inside him like fire. He had wanted to humiliate a waitress, yet now he was the one humiliated, his arrogance laid bare for all to see. Clara, however, did not glance his way. She stood quietly, her gaze moving across the crowd, taking in the faces of people who had doubted her, who had laughed, who were now clapping with genuine respect. She felt something rise in her chest, a strength she had always carried but never shown. The businessman tried one last time. He stood, raising his glass as though giving a toast. His voice boomed, though it wavered slightly. "Well," he said with forced cheer, "it seems our waitress has surprised us all tonight. A charming little performance, indeed." Some guests turned to him, but their applause did not stop. His words fell flat, drowned in the admiration still pouring toward Clara. For once, he was not the center of attention. For once, his power meant nothing. The woman in pearls near the front stood and called out, "That was no little performance. That was brilliance." Her voice rang with conviction, and many others nodded in agreement. The businessman's smile cracked. He lowered his glass, his hand trembling just slightly. He sat back down heavily, his eyes dark with frustration. Clara stood tall beside the piano, the sound of applause still echoing around her. She felt no need to look at him, no need to answer his earlier mockery. His silence was answer enough. In that moment, the balance of the room had shifted. She was no longer just a waitress. She was an artist, a musician, a woman who had commanded a room full of strangers and left them speechless. The businessman stared at her, his pride shattered. He had tried to make her small, but she had risen taller than he could ever reach. The applause thundered through the grand dining hall, bouncing against the high ceilings and polished marble walls. It was not the polite kind of clapping given out of courtesy. It was strong, alive, filled with real admiration. For Clara, it felt like a wave rising higher and higher, lifting her in a way she had never imagined. She stood by the piano, her hands still trembling slightly, but her heart steady and full. All around her, guests who had once smirked and whispered now clapped with shining eyes. Some even cheered. A few people stood, giving her the honor usually reserved for great performers. The chandeliers sparkled above her, as though even the light itself had joined in her victory. For a moment, Clara did not move. She simply let the sound wash over her, warming the deepest parts of her soul. She had not played for applause. She had not played to impress. She had played because she loved music, because it was the truest part of herself. But now, standing in the middle of that storm of clapping, she realized something: the world had finally seen her. At the back of the hall, a waiter wiped at his eyes with his sleeve, pretending it was dust. Another leaned against the wall, smiling proudly, as though Clara's triumph belonged to all of them. The staff, who often went unnoticed, now watched one of their own shine brighter than anyone in the room. The businessman remained seated, his face tight, his eyes dark with wounded pride. He had tried to turn her into a joke, but the joke had turned on him. No one was laughing at Clara anymore. If anything, they were looking at him with quiet judgment. His power, his arrogance, his wealth, all of it had failed to silence the truth of her music. Clara did not look at him. She did not need to. She knew that his silence was her victory. She turned instead toward the guests who continued to applaud, her gaze steady but gentle. For the first time in her life, she felt what it meant to be seen, not as a servant carrying trays, but as a woman with a gift worth honoring. Slowly, she bowed her head in gratitude. The applause swelled again, echoing like thunder. She straightened, her chin high, her posture proud. For once, she carried herself not with the quiet patience of a waitress, but with the dignity of an artist who had claimed her place. When the clapping finally began to fade, a soft murmur spread across the hall. Guests whispered to one another, words like beautiful, extraordinary, and unforgettable floating through the air. A man in the front row turned to his companion and said, "I've heard musicians in great halls, but none have ever moved me like that." His voice carried, and others nodded in agreement. The woman in pearls wiped at her eyes and called out, "Thank you." It was simple, but the weight of her voice made the word echo louder than all the applause. Clara's heart swelled. She stepped back from the piano, her hands clasped together in front of her. She wanted to smile, but her lips trembled too much. Instead, she let the glow in her eyes speak for her. She had shared a piece of her soul, and they had accepted it. The manager of the hotel appeared from the side of the room, his face a mixture of shock and pride. He had always thought of Clara as one of his best waitresses, reliable and hard-working, but never had he imagined this. He gave her a small nod of respect, something rare from him, and she nodded back quietly. Clara knew the night had changed everything. Perhaps not her job, perhaps not her struggles, but something deeper. She had proven, not just to them but to herself, that her music mattered. That her voice, once hidden in shadows, could fill even the grandest of rooms. The businessman finally rose from his chair. He tried to gather his dignity, but it was clear to everyone that he had been humbled. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came. His companions avoided his eyes, unwilling to share in his defeat. For the first time in years, he was not the man in control. He was the man left speechless. Clara glanced his way only once, her eyes calm and unshaken. She did not smile at him, nor did she frown. She gave him nothing. That, more than anything, was her triumph. He had demanded her attention, her humiliation, her submission, but he received none. Instead, Clara turned back to the piano and placed her hand gently on the polished wood, almost like a farewell. She had given the instrument her heart, and it had carried her to victory. She would never forget that. As the night resumed, the guests returned to their meals, though the air in the hall was different now. The laughter was softer, the conversations filled with talk of the waitress who had stunned them all. Clara quietly returned to her duties, carrying trays once again, but everywhere she walked, she felt eyes on her, not with disdain, but with respect. Some guests smiled warmly at her as she passed. A few even whispered words of thanks. It was subtle, but it was enough. She was no longer invisible. Clara carried plates, poured drinks, and cleared tables, but inside she carried something more precious, the knowledge that she had stood before them all, faced mockery, and turned it into music. Later that night, when the hall was empty and the guests had gone, Clara paused by the piano once more. The room was quiet now, the chandeliers dimmed, the marble floor shining under the faint glow of lanterns. She touched the keys softly, pressing a single note. It rang out in the empty space, pure and true. She smiled then, a soft smile meant only for herself. She whispered quietly, "I did it." And she had. The rich man had tried to mock her, but she had left him silent. The crowd had doubted her, but she had left them standing. Clara had not just played the piano, she had claimed her place, her dignity, her truth. That night, she walked away taller than ever, carrying nothing but trays in her hands but carrying triumph in her heart.